Beginning in the early summer of 1942, a group of young college students resisting the Nazis was formed and later came to be called the White Rose. The Nazis were a group of mostly Germans who despised the Jews. The group decided that it was their moral duty to oppose the Nazis and put an end to Nazi rule, especially because of the Holocaust, which was a time where most of the Jews were persecuted by the Nazis. The group mainly targeted scholars or people who were smart enough to think for themselves because they could easily spread the group's message. The White Rose recruited Germans and other people by distributing pamphlets secretly and by having weekly discussions at college campuses. Even though it was illegal criticizing the Nazi government at the time, it did not stop the White Rose from getting out their message. They strongly explained their reasoning for resisting the Nazis in the pamphlets, saying how cruel the Nazis had been to the people they thought were lesser than them. The pamphlets were written and handed out in a 2-year time period, and the members of the group were eventually killed. The White Rose at the time never made that big of an impact, but it caused most Germans to question their actions, including persecuting the Jews and discouraging people's freedoms and rights. Although the White Rose was unsuccessful, it was the start of the abolition of the Nazis.
On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi, was named Chancellor by President Paul von Hindenburg after the Nazi Party won a major percentage of the vote in the elections of 1932. The Nazi Party had taken advantage of the political unrest in Germany to gain an electoral grip. The Holocaust refers to the period from January 30th, 1933, when Adolf Hitler took power, to May 8th, 1945, when the war in Europe ended. During this time, Jews in Europe were subjected to increasingly harsh discrimination that mainly led to the murder of 6 million Jews, 1.5 of these being children, and the destruction of 5,000 Jewish communities.
In the early summer of 1941, a group of students formed a non-violent resistance group in Nazi Germany. Most of the members were medical students except for Sophie Scholl, who majored in biology and philosophy. They shared a common interest and a deep love for art, music, literature, and philosophy. Most of them had Jewish friends or classmates who were evicted or deported, or who had suffered in the Kristallnacht. The group was made up of mainly 5 students at Munich University: Sophie Scholl, her brother Hans Scholl, Alex Chamorro, Willy Graf, and Christoph Probst, all in their early 20s. Also a member was Hans and Sophie's younger sister Inga Scholl, and a professor of philosophy, Kurt Huber. What the students thought was a small protest group evolved into something much larger than they had expected.
The White Rose had various reasons of why they formed the group. The main reason was the Holocaust. Hans and Sophie, like many other German teenagers, were enlisted in the Hitler Youth, which was an organization set up by Hitler that taught young German students aging from 13 to 18 the Nazi principles. Their father disapproved of them being in the Hitler Youth. Hans realized why their dad disapproved, and his dad gave him the first idea to carry out the word to be against the Nazis. They believed that the young people of Germany had the potential to overthrow Adolf Hitler and Nazi government. They were very much influenced by blessed John Henry Newman, who was an important figure in the religious history of England. They were inspired mostly by his teaching and conscience.
In the summer of 1942, Alex and Hans wrote the first 4 leaflets, copied each on a typewriter with as many copies that could be made, which was no more than 100, and distributed them throughout Germany anonymously. The leaflets caused an uproar in Germany. Many people were arrested and convicted of writing the leaflets by the Gestapo. In the first leaflet, they wrote, "Do not forget that every people deserves the regime they're willing to endure." This was a very bold statement at the time, which many Germans did not react well to. Alex and Hans wrote in the leaflet about how Germans were murdering millions of people and clearly expressed their feelings and oppositions. They were horrified by the concentration camps and the behavior of the Nazis.
At least a few hundred of the leaflets were turned in to the Nazi police. Just possessing such a leaflet could result in a long prison sentence. Besides, many people believed that this could be a Nazi setup, similar to the burning of the Reichstag building, where these were leaflets being sent out by the Nazis themselves, and anybody not fulfilling their patriotic duty in turning these in would be arrested. However, even with the number of leaflets that came in, after weeks had passed, the investigators still had no clue as to who was behind them. If that weren't unsettling enough for the authorities, there was a concentration of them coming from Munich, which was the favorite city of Hitler and a stronghold of Nazi power.
Taking leaflets to other cities carried great risks because trains were constantly patrolled by the Gestapo, who demanded identification papers of any male of military age. Anyone traveling without official marching papers was absent without official leave, and the consequence predictable.
The leaflets were left in phone books, public phone booths, and people mailed them to friends and family throughout Germany. All 4 leaflets were written in a rather fast time period between June and July. Each leaflet was sent to each member of the White Rose so they could check whether they were intercepted. Of the first 100 leaflets to be printed, 35 of them were taken by the Gestapo. The 5th and 6th leaflet were written by both Kurt and Willie. Each leaflet was more critical of Hitler and the German people than the last. The 5th leaflet said, "Hitler is leading the German people into the abyss. Are we forever a nation which is hated and rejected by all mankind?"
In February 1943, Hans, Alex, and Willie conducted the most dangerous of all the White Rose activities. They used tar and paint to write sayings on the side of houses in Ludwigstrasse. They wrote, "Down with Hitler," "Hitler mass murderer," "Freedom," and drew crossed-out swastikas. This, while policemen and other officials patrolled the streets of Munich. It was by far the most public and dangerous of all their activities.
On Thursday, February 18th, 1943, Sophie and Hans distributed the pamphlets personally at the University of Munich. They hurriedly dropped stacks of copies in the empty corridors for students to find when they flooded out of the lecture rooms. Leaving before the class break, Schulz noticed that some copies remained in the suitcase and decided it would be a pity not to distribute them. They returned to the atrium and climbed the staircase to the top floor, and Sophie flung the last remaining leaflets into the air. This action was observed by the custodian. The police were called, and Hans and Sophie were taken into Gestapo custody. The other active members were soon arrested, and the group and everyone associated with them were brought in for interrogation.
They, along with Christoph, were arrested. Within days, all 3 were brought before the People's Court in Berlin. The court trial lasted only a few hours. They're convicted of treason and sentenced to death. The prison guard permitted Hans, Sophie, and Christoph to have one last visit together. Sophie was then led to the guillotine. One observer described her as she walked to her death, without turning a hair, without flinching. Christoph was next, Hans was last. Just before he was beheaded, Hans cried out, "Long live freedom."
Unfortunately, they were not the last to die. The Gestapo's investigation was insistent. Later tried and executed were Alex, Willie, and Kurt. Students at the University of Hamburg were either executed or sent to concentration camps. Later that same year, other members of the White Rose, Alexander, Willie, Kurt, Inga Scholl, her parents, and over 80 others, were suspected of being members of the White Rose, were taken into custody. Kurt, Alexander, and Willie were found guilty of sedition and executed. Most of the other students convicted for their part in the group's activities received prison sentences. University students continued their studies as usual. Citizens mentioned nothing, many regarding the movement as anti-national. Their actions were mostly dismissed until after the war, when their efforts were eventually praised by the German conscience.
After the infiltration and breakup of the White Rose in Munich, the Nazis were fought by many other groups after the White Rose, which eventually led to the end of the Nazi rule. As the end of the war grew near, the risks and oppositions became smaller, for as German rulers became aware of their downfall, their punishments became more severe. This was their idea of revenge, to pull as many resistors down to death with them as they possibly could. Despite this, those that were inspired by the White Rose continued to openly resist and oppose the Nazi government and to spread their message just as the original members had done.
Today, most Germans know the story of the White Rose. A square at the University of Munich is named after Hans and Sophie Scholl, and there are streets, squares, and schools all over Germany named for the members of the White Rose. There are a few memorials dedicated to the White Rose located at the University of Munich and in Ulm, Germany. Sophie was greatly admired by her actions and was voted to be the woman of the 20th century. There were more than 190 schools named after her. She was called the greatest German woman of all time. The White Rose didn't make a big impact at the time, but inspired other groups to form and defeat the Nazis. Today, the White Rose is remembered, admired, and honored by their brave and powerful decisions that made many people independent.